I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I'm very, very, very happy to be with Ed Park at our store on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which we are doing our first live taping. So if you hear background noise, if you hear other stuff, it's because we're live in the middle of a bookstore. So thank you, Ed, for being here. 15 years after Personal Days, which is one of my favorite novels. 15 years,
15
dude,
years.
15 years. Same bed, different dreams. It's a gorgeous title, but it's long.
15 years, though.
I know.
Yeah, that's, talk about long.
Okay.
It's maybe no coincidence that my oldest son is 15 years old.
Okay.
I'm just throwing that out there.
So is this where I get to ask you how you managed to load the dishwasher and write and raise your kids at the same time?
Yeah. Well, it's, I don't want to sound like a single dad. My wife is here in the audience. But,
I'm just being sarcastic. I'm sorry. That is a question that women writers get asked all the time, and
Yeah.
I'm just kind of like, men do it too.
Although, just as a side note, the place where I write in the apartment is like 10 feet from the dishwasher. So I actually do a lot of putting the plates in, taking them out. I find it meditative. It helps me when I'm...
I hate the dishwasher. I really do, but so be it. All right, so 15 years after Personal Days, you have written a dystopian epic that pulls from movie history and science fiction and tech and, of course, the literary world, which you hit a little close to the bone there a couple of times. This is a very Ed Park book to me. I feel like this is all of the stuff I've seen you do in the New York Review of Books, all of the stuff I've seen you do in the New Yorker and Book Forum, all of these places, and now we get it in a novel. Yeah?
Yeah. I write for all these places and fiction, but also a lot of articles and reviews. And I've also worked as an editor. And so when I started writing those pieces, it was sort of a sideline. But, I take those assignments pretty seriously. And, I say yes far too often. So if somebody's like, could you write about, Thomas Pynchon or something? And I'm like, sure. And then, 3 months later, I come out with this thing. But I think doing that kind of research and sort of honing my thoughts on these different writers, all of whom I find fascinating, over the years, and we're talking 15 years, right? That's got to kind of leak into my brain a bit. And in fact, some of those writers, especially a couple of Korean writers from the past that I've written about for the New York Review, they appear as, fictionalized versions of themselves in Same Bed, Different Dreams. So it all kind of feeds into each other.
So we've got 3 storylines.
Yeah.
All of this novel, all 518 pages, give or take?
Something like that, yeah.
Flies.
Thank you.
It flies. I could not believe how, and I read pretty quickly, but there was going to be no interruption of the reading. There was going to be absolutely no interruption. And the world felt really familiar to me. And that's with all of the gizmos that Ed has invented. Some of them are, vaguely familiar. But I knew where I was.
Good.
At every single point. You didn't lose me once. And you're doing some structural stuff in this book.
Yeah.
How many of you have read Personal Days? I'm assuming most of you have, right? Okay, so you know that thing he does with the voice and you switch between the 3 sections, right? Okay, this is one of the reasons we love Ed. What you're doing structurally in Same Bed, Different Dreams is even beyond that.
Yeah.
And I'm not chalking that up to you had 15 years to play with it, because sometimes 15 years playing with a manuscript is not actually a good thing.
Right.
So I want to talk about how you wrangled this into what we get to experience.
Sure. Well, it's been 15 years since Personal Days. It's been about 9 years of working on this book. So there was, I guess, what's the math here? 6 years of, I don't know. I was actually working on other stuff that, didn't kind of come to fruition. But for this book, it started with what's now like the second chapter. And it's a storyline that follows a character named Soon Sheen. He's kind of like an Ed Park stand-in in some ways. My age, from Buffalo, parents are from Korea, played hockey growing up, etc. But then it kind of it deviates from like my biography, and he's working upstate at a tech company called Gloat, which is sort of a combination of the big. It's kind of a
The
dream
obvious and the more obvious.
like exactly. At first it was like more of a social media thing, but then I was like, let's just bundle it all together.
Right.
And that storyline takes place around 2016 over the course of just a couple months. And those chapters are staggered throughout the book, and that's kind of a through line in terms of the I voice.
Yeah.
And so that's where you see sort of the kind of the literary satire, the publishing industry satire you mentioned.
Dude, there
Yeah.
was a little too much of.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
it's all completely made up. Nobody. It's not a Ramona Clay.
Yes, I understand that, but the you hit some buttons
Some
that
buttons. Yeah.
I thought had been left in the 90s, and I was a little annoyed. But
Well, it was, that the first scene in the book, with this character, it's like a big dinner party with a lot of sort of literary types, and I was just having fun. It was like a party in my mind where these people could talk, and I kind of went with that for a while. Just like there are a lot of characters introduced early on, and I just kind of follow them. And to make a long story short, it just kept going, and some of it was really good, and other parts I got a little lost, and at a certain point I realized this cannot be the book. Like,
Right.
there's a strong voice, but it peters out around page 400 or something. But then
Dude.
I'm joking. But there's that feeling, like, also as the years go on, you're like, I'm working. Something's got to give. Like, something's not working if you don't feel like you're arriving at a better version of it. Every day. And I had a literary revelation. I read a book called Big Bang by a writer named David Bowman, a posthumous novel that was kind of like unlike.
oh,
do you know
let
what
the
I'm
dog drive the car.
Yeah,
that
Let
guy.
the Dog Drive. Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
yeah.
Well, so he wrote a book called Let the Dog Drive in the 90s that NYU Press published, and I love that book. It's like a kind of a cult classic.
Right.
And he sort of faded. He wrote a couple other books, and he sort of faded from the scene, and he died quite young. But anyway, this Jonathan Lethem actually edited this posthumous manuscript. It's a great book if you're at all interested in mid-century American history, pop culture. It's all there. But it kind of gave me permission to like think about Korean history that way. Like, what if I were to write a book where I could talk about all the things that I found fascinating about Korean history, early Korean American history, and American history, to be honest,
Right.
and how these things kind of interweave. So I started writing that, just these almost like notes to myself, just to be like, let's talk about Yi Sung, this modernist poet from the 20s, who's like writes these poems that are all numbers. Let's talk about Syngman Rhee, who becomes the first president of South Korea. And I realized that this was actually not a separate project, but it belonged in the bigger novel. So that's the second thread, the second kind of section of the book. I mean, they're called dreams. So dream 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and those are kind of in between the other narrative. This is you should probably be diagramming this because it's
No.
pretty
Wait.
tough stuff.
No.
Okay.
Wait. You don't have to diagram it. You just have to turn the pages.
Thank you.
And let yourself go. Because I'm telling you, you will recognize this world. And yes, I'm talking about a dystopian novel like, it's Thursday in a bookstore. I'm talking about a dystopian novel. But the familiarity, and I don't know, we don't teach Korean history. We know this, right? I don't know Korean history probably the way I should. I'm also going to take a moment and say we have to come back to the Japanese. We're going to talk about Japan, and that's their relationship to Korea as well, and imperialism and colonialism, because you can't talk about the history of Korea without talking about these pieces. And then you can't talk about what happened to Korea without talking about American imperialism, right? And then I get to add a layer to it because I'm part Japanese and part Taiwanese, and if you know, you know. Hello, imperialism. We have a very complicated history there, too. So all of these pieces, right, that we don't teach in the U.S., like we really, in some cases, don't even now know how to have that conversation about what it means to be Asian American or where we're going as Asian Americans or whether or not we are a unified community, right? All of this plays in to what you're doing.
Well, I think what you're saying, like we don't know how to teach this. We don't know what. I mean, I'm an old man now. One reason I didn't write this book in my 20s, I think, is because that it is a question. Like, what is Asian American? What is Korean American? Like, you're not really taught that in school, and so it's been kind of a lifetime of thinking about it and trying to like work it into fiction.
And also Asian American identity too really belonged to the West Coast. When you and I were young, it belonged to LA, it belonged to San Francisco. Like,
that's a good point.
People will fight over who invented the nomenclature itself, right? Like, was it San Francisco? Was it Berkeley? Was it UCLA? I'm not going to get in the middle of that fight because I will lose. I was born in Boston. I was first and only in too many rooms. I was integrating my nursery school. But there's a much stronger Asian American identity on the West Coast than there is on the East Coast. You grew up in Buffalo, man.
I grew up in
you
Buffalo.
were first and only in a lot of rooms too.
Yeah, I mean, there was, kind of a small but tight-knit Korean community there, but it was also like, consciously or not, you're assimilating, right? And
Does Buffalo have a K-Town?
No. I think it has 2 Korean restaurants.
So
yeah.
Boston,
and when I was growing up, it had maybe 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
Boston still doesn't have a K-Town. But Chinatown in Boston, when I was a kid, it was like 3 blocks. And that was kind of a stretch. And then you hit the combat zone. So, I get to New York and there's a Chinatown here, but LA still has a little Tokyo, and yes, it's shrinking, but it still exists. Like Seattle still has a Japantown. Like, these tiny, tiny pockets still are there, but we haven't figured out as Americans how to talk about that piece of our experience. You're doing that here, though, in this book. In a way that, we couldn't have done in our 20s. Right. There's no way.
Right.
There's no way.
I think it's, having distance from that time in my life and also, having the privilege of of being alive and just kind of seeing how history, extends and where we are now. It's kind of crazy. Like, there are so many Korean American novels and works of fiction published this year. And, for growing up, there certainly weren't any. There were like 2 books in 50 years or something.
Dude, it was a wasteland.
So so things have changed, and I think 9 years ago when I started writing it, I think there was this idea. We mentioned Personal Days, my first book, which is kind of this. It's an office comedy, but race is not really a part of it, right? And in fact, sometimes we don't even know the characters' last names. It comes in a little bit, but it was almost like I was saving all my thinking around that for this book.
I don't think the world was ready for Personal Days to have been a different book. If you think about the conversations we have about race now, that still makes some people profoundly uncomfortable. When I look back at sort of what the landscape looked like in the 90s, certainly late 90s, early aughts, publishing was having this moment where a lot of energy was going into sort of what we were calling diverse voices, right? And then it stopped for a while because suddenly everyone was like, well, no one's really buying these books. And it's like, well, no, actually, they are when they can find them. That's a whole different conversation. But then we had a moment where it was kind of like, okay, we hit our quota. Right? And now we're seeing that energy come back. We're seeing people who are looking for more, and some of that energy is going into YA publishing. Some of that energy is going into genres like romance and sci-fi. Like, sci-fi used to be sort of this extremely white landscape for a very, very long time, and all of the people winning the prizes and all of the bestsellers and whatnot. Even, I'm sorry, elves, right? We're writing about elves. We're writing about pointy ears and lasers, and we can't talk about race? Okay, cool. And I do want to bring in sci-fi because you're teaching sci-fi in a way at Princeton. There is a sci-fi piece running through this. You have a great character. And I like the idea that we can play with the genre and we can use genre to talk about the stuff that makes it profoundly uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think that was my intention. I mean, I've always read science fiction. I'm teaching a speculative fiction workshop, which has been really fun. I've taught standard writing workshops before, but now this time, every story is about the multiverse, like time travel, all these crazy things happen. So it's just very entertaining to kind of get these stories. The way it functions in Same Bed, Different Dreams is, so I mentioned that these 2 threads that going through, these 2 narrative threads. There's a third one, which is a little bit harder to explain, but each of those chapters is titled 2333. And so it's kind of a futuristic date, right? There's a science fiction writer who is a former Korean War fighter pilot named Parker Jotter. He's African American. He lives in Buffalo, and he runs an electronics store, like an appliance store. This is kind of the typical occupation of a Philip K. Dick character. Like if you read Philip K. Dick, that's what a lot of his characters do. But what I wanted to do was have this character, Parker Jotter. He's writing these science fiction novels on the side and getting them published. They have kind of a small following, and some of his readers think that there are things about Korea in his book based on his experience. Because when he was fighting in Korea, he saw, for lack of a better term, a UFO. He was captured, jailed by the North, by the communists. And he doesn't really talk about that stuff. And so one of the conceits is that in his science fiction, which supposedly has nothing to do with our world, these kind of pieces of Korean history and folklore and stuff are creeping into his book, and he flatly denies it. So that's where the science fiction kind of comes into this novel.
But now I'm going to be slightly difficult for a second, because alien is a word that gets thrown around at people who look like you and I.
Yeah.
I mean,
it sure does.
Dude, you're from Buffalo.
Right.
I mean, you can take Amtrak to Buffalo.
Yeah.
Boston, I have a choice. I can take, Amtrak, or I can fly. Actually, you can fly to Buffalo,
I can fly
right?
to Buffalo,
okay, all right. So shows you how much I know about Buffalo.
Buffalo's farther than Boston from New York.
Okay, that's just
gonna say. New York is a very long state. Just saying.
I'm a city person.
I know.
I'm just better in cities. That's really all I can. And I realize Buffalo's a city, but y'all understand what I'm saying. But this idea, though, that you can take science fiction and turn it on its ear. Like, let's sit with that for a second. Because honestly, right, there's this expectation sometimes that we're going to write a certain kind of narrative. It's going to be an immigrant story. It's going to be this. It's going to be that. We have to we have to color within the lines, right? Like, icky metaphor, but there you have it. And you blow up all of that with this book. All of it. Yeah. All of it. The tech bros even. I mean, please make more fun of tech bros. Please, everyone should be, and excuse me if anyone here is a tech bro, I'm sorry. But that culture, right? Like that culture, and when you look at kids of color who are part of that whole tech world, they sort of become a different kind of person in a way, right? Like they become the broiest of the bros.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at them going, you're still you.
What's happened? Yeah.
You're still brown.
Right. You're right. One of the things I wanted to do, or maybe this is just part, Personal Days was an office novel, but I didn't want it to be a typical office novel. Right. Like it would be funny, but I'm going to do stuff with the structure. Like it's just part of who I am, especially as a fiction writer. And with this book, the canvas is bigger, and I knew that these three parts all had to kind of work differently. And even within like the 2333 thread, I do something where each chapter of it jumps forward a decade and is done in a different stuff. So I'm constantly trying to, keep it fresh for me, because I feel like if I'm fascinated by what's on the page, like the reader will be as well. And I think that maybe, we've been talking about sort of Asian American literature and as a concept. Obviously, I want it to stand out in some ways, like no other book will be like this, but also maybe to hopefully show people what, and I'm talking about writers, what is possible, if that doesn't sound too immodest.
No, because one of the things I've been noticing in the reviews of the new book too is, people are throwing around names like Pynchon and DeLillo, and I'm like, it's about time, right? Like, why shouldn't you just sit? Yeah. You clearly, they are big influences for you, right? Young-Hil Kang, also a big influence for you. But, you pull from so many different places in so many different ways. And to me, that's American literature, right? Like, we shouldn't just be saying, it's got to be here on the shelf. Like, write the thing you're going to write. But, of course, we're going to bring all of the influences.
Yeah.
You're always going to have hockey in a book, dude. Yeah. I know this. Like, I'm not going to read an Ed Park novel and not have a little hockey.
A little hockey,
and I'm good with it.
Okay.
The New England, everyone gets skates when they're little. Like, you show up and they're like, here's a pair of skates. Don't try not to kill yourself, but go. But this idea, right, that you are some sort of hyphen or an alien or anything else, it's like, no, you're a dude from Buffalo writing this book.
Yeah. I think, the hockey thing is interesting because, when I started writing it, I was thinking, hockey was not on my mind, let's say, but at a certain point...
What?
Well, I didn't set out to write a book where hockey played a role.
All I'm saying is hockey is just been a thing for you since you were tiny. So how is it not going to somehow work in there?
Well, I think over the years, as I'm working on this, you kind of like go deeper into your memory, right? And into things that you're interested in. And then I realized that, this is dating myself, but like in the early 2000, let's say 20 years ago, or even more than that, I had written a line just for a little couple page thing that I was trying out. Somebody basically says, I believe the Korean War never ended, and I believe that the 1999 Stanley Cup Finals were never resolved. So that's when the Sabres lost to the Dallas Stars, and there are still people who say that because the winning goal was scored by Brett Hull when his foot was in the crease, like that shouldn't count. And so anyway, but it's sort of like a ridiculous conceit, right? To compare these things of, the magnitude is completely different. But writing this book, I got to this part where I was like, well, what if somebody thought that?
So if you do have a question and it's on an index card, please would you give it to Jason? I just also like to work in questions as we go, because there's nothing more boring than sitting around waiting for your question to be asked.
Here we go.
I mean, as you can tell, I do my homework, but I'm also curious to see what you guys are thinking. Oh, interesting. Did Fred Armisen's discovery of his Korean father's heritage, which he had thought was Japanese, inspire the character whose father tells him he's Korean and not Japanese? Is this a common phenomenon?
It might be more common than you think, and that's not really a spoiler. It happens early in the book, and that was definitely written pre Fred Armisen. But that episode was fascinating, the Finding Your Roots show, where all his life thought he was his grandfather was this very famous Japanese modern dancer, and had turned out to be a spy. But then, on that show, they've discovered that part of the family actually came from Korea and, changed their name. So there is a character, not the main character, but there's another character in the book where that is the case.
Right.
Yeah.
Koreans in Japan have a really rough go of it. And, there's a lot to love about some aspects of Japanese culture, but there's just some really weird stuff. There's just some really, really weird stuff. And this idea that you can be that insular and I don't know. I think there's a better way to handle it. But again, no one in Japan has asked me for my opinion on the subject, so maybe I should just stop. But I come back to this idea of a pan-Asian American identity, right? Like, we're a little complicated. We're a little messy. Yeah. Like, we really would like to do better. And sometimes I look around and I'm like, wow, okay. Like, there are moments where I look at the community and I'm just like, yeah, we could do better. We could do better. Wow, we could do better. It's interesting to me the way you play with identity. And the one thing, Ed and I agreed when we were talking about this morning that we were not going to do any spoilers. The book is 2 days old. I am not going to take the pleasure of reading this book away from you or anyone listening to the show. So we're staying far, far away from spoilers. But I will tell you that when I got to the end of the book, I yelled because it is so satisfying. And he does a thing that I'm not going to steal from you guys, but it was amazing. But it's also playing off of identity.
Sure, yeah.
In a way that isn't necessarily about race, but it's also not about race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to tiptoe around it.
Yeah.
I was so happy when Miwa sent me a message this morning that was full of expletives, but in a really good way. And I guess I want to say, what the book has sections that there is a lot of history in it, but it's like only the good parts. Like, I just want it to be entertaining on the one hand, and so I've put in all these, kind of revelations and like twists and stuff. So that's exactly the effect I wanted it to have when you got to that point. Yeah, but if maybe stepping back from the end for a moment, maybe I should just mention what the Korean Provisional Government is.
Okay.
As a way of getting. Yeah. Well, as a way of getting.
Okay, fair. That is not a spoiler. It is actually maybe a thing you should know, but you have to tread gently.
Yes. Well, just the narrator Soon Shin, who I mentioned at the beginning. He comes across this manuscript by a Korean novelist, and it's called Same Bed, Different Dreams. And the manuscript is a novel that proposes that something called the Korean Provisional Government, which was founded in 1919 when Korea was a colony. And the idea was like, this was a government in exile, didn't really have any power, but it was like to tell the world, hey, we're, we should be free. We're we were a country for thousands of years, blah, blah, blah. And nobody was really listening. But the conceit is that in this novel, within the novel, that the KPG, in fact, still exists.
Right.
It did not dissolve after World War II. It kept going. So some real people who are in it, like Syngman Rhee, are named, and I kind of get into their lives. But then I also, or my author in the book, ropes in all sorts of people. Some of them aren't even Korean.
Gently.
So that's, but it's sort of a way, I guess, to maybe make both, kind of American readers as a whole, but also, also obviously Korean Americans, like, think of what is the relationship between Korean history and American history. Right. Yeah.
But what is history, right? You asked this multiple times throughout the book. What is history? Why can't you just tell the good bits? Because that's really what a history book is. It's just telling the good bits.
I'm a little nervous because my college roommate is here. He was a history major, and I wasn't. I do bring that up. That's the very first sentence of the whole book. And I look, I kind of subject history to various fictional treatments.
Okay.
But I kind of think that the answer to that question, and that question is repeated, right? It's threaded through the book and in the various different sections that I've mentioned. And I think the answer to that question is the book. Like, I think, you kind of throw out this abstract question, but to get to something approaching an answer, it's like I had to use everything I knew and everything I knew about writing to like kind of make this thing that's also about, like you said earlier, identity and a way of kind of squaring that with what I know or what I've felt and thought about history.
I mean, we're sitting here making history, not the kind that's, obviously we're releasing the show into the world, but we are sitting here in a moment where we are making history.
Yeah.
You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, it's about to become history. I think we need to change our definition of what history is, right? It's not just a 1,000-page book that has been researched and footnoted and everything else. We're it.
Yeah.
History doesn't exist without us. Right. The question is, how do we tell it and who do we let tell it and how do we claim it back? When someone may have... MASH comes up, obviously, a lot in this book. And I realized MASH was like the most watched television show ever in the history of the 80s. Blah, 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 blah. And I had a math teacher in elementary school who had actually served in the army, and he used to wig out when kids would talk about math. And I don't blame him. He clearly had a very bad experience, and he was like, "It was not like that in Bubble."
It wasn't. It wasn't a comedy.
Oh no! And seriously, I totally get it. But I'm just watching this math teacher. I felt very bad for him, even as a tiny person, because I was like, "This is not good. Like whatever is happening here is not good." But I also really hated math and just kind of not wanted to not be in the room. We have these ideas, right? There are people who genuinely believe whatever they were. I warned you I was going to bring this up, but we got to talk about Incheon for a second. That movie, was it really produced by the Moonies?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so you mentioned, everybody knows what MASH is, right? It was the series finale in 1983. I put that in the book. It's still like I think the most watched non-sports thing in history. 1983 is like an important date in the book, and when I saw that. And I remember, I don't know if people here are old enough. Did people watch it in 83? Yeah. I remember watching it. I actually watched a lot of MASH because it was on constantly and it was on after school.
Yeah.
And so, but it was a weird way for me to think about Korean history. I don't think that's what I was consciously thinking, but it's like, my parents lived through the Korean War. Right. My dad was a teenager during the war, but later he was in a MASH. He served in a MASH in the Korean Army. But it's this comedy. All the Asian characters are kind of like off to the side. It's filmed in Malibu or wherever. One of the things I wanted to do in some sections of the book is kind of look at popular representations of Korean history and the Korean War. And so you bring up Incheon, which is a movie that it was in theaters for like a millisecond. I believe in 81 it finally came out, and it was produced by the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And I don't know exactly how much it cost, but it was very expensive. They paid to have like a cat. If you can imagine the early '80s, like Laurence Olivier plays MacArthur. Is it Toshiro Mifune plays? I don't even know what his character was supposed to be, but he's in it. Omar Sharif is in it.
It sounds like the Winds of War.
But it's
it sounds like one of
War
those
was around
like
that time.
epic.
Yeah.
Remember when there were miniseries on ABC and like your mom's friends would watch them and you would just quietly slink out of the room.
It's a very critically reviled, and it often comes up on a list of like biggest turkeys ever. But you actually watch it and it's kind of like parts of it don't make sense. I still don't maybe get all of it, but it's sort of fascinating just as this cinematic artifact where why did he want to make this movie? Why did he spend so much getting I think he also hired like the South Korean army to like actually be in the movie. Anyway, it was and it's sort of like that part of the book is talking about the 80s. So it was really something I couldn't let go of. One other thing I'll say, if we're talking about history, I was also thinking about like what you remember, right? Yeah. So I remember MASH. I remember this. I actually never saw it in the theaters because it was there just like, I think just one weekend. It was gone before the next weekend. But in the book, my characters obviously go see it. Odd Job from... do we know Odd Job from Goldfinger? Played by a Japanese actor in the movie, but you read Goldfinger and the way Koreans are described, it's just like it's like beyond racist. It's like its own thing. So I like couldn't resist, putting these things in like pop culture.
But also,
references.
Why shouldn't we claim that back?
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
Like honestly, Douglas MacArthar really dude has. Wow, there were some words that came out of his mouth, and I was like, that. Okay. Yeah. Why shouldn't we?
Exactly. Like, I feel like if they're in my book, then it is sort of an act of reclamation and maybe reframing.
I mean, if we don't do it, someone else is going to keep doing it around us, so we may as well.
But also, I don't know that people think about MASH or Incheon these days, so I feel like it's within living memory for me.
Okay,
so
maybe they're not waking up and saying, "Oh, let's think about Alan Alda and MASH today," but. I do think some of the ideas that they pick up,
you're right.
They carry that around, and you may not know. Nostalgia can be weaponized, right? Nostalgia can be absolutely weaponized, and I think there are times where people do it unconsciously.
Yeah.
And it's really annoying, and I would like it to stop. I would really like it to stop. But I don't think it's necessarily... I think there's a lot that happens that isn't always intentional.
Right.
And if we don't have these conversations, if we don't ask these questions about where that attitude came from, then we're stuck in a Groundhog Day loop. And, that movie's cute, but I would like to not live...
Like to get
thank you.
We'll move on to the next day.
Really, I'm good with that. And granted, I'm talking to the guy who can connect The Notebook with Ryan Gosling and Rachel McAdams to Ágota Kristóf, but
the Hungarian,
Hungarian
novelist who wrote another book called The Notebook. Yeah,
I know, but you did it in the pages of the New York Review. I had fun with that.
That's what they pay me for.
I know. Do more of it, please. I mean, I was trying to figure out if I could work in a joke about the Fast and the Furious, and I was like, no, can't do it. But I'm going to try anyway. Okay. All right. So, most fun thing about writing this book?
Most fun thing?
Mm-hmm. Since I keep hitting on the hard stuff.
Yeah, well, I believe Jonathan Franzen said this at a panel or something. He said, if you're writing it and you're having fun, it's probably good. If you're writing it and you're not enjoying it, it's probably not that good. So when you get to that point where, for example, in these historical sections called the dreams, when I was it was kind of like this fire hose effect, like just like all these ideas kept parts of episodes from history, from TV, from movies, like they just kept coming, and I was like, they all belong in the book. And it was this almost, somewhat manic idea that these all belong together. Mm-hmm. And I did cut some things that as the book got longer and longer, but there's a way, like the most fun thing, I guess, is when you see those elements that you put in without kind of knowing how they connect, and then finding a connection. And I think no spoilers, but there are a couple places that
there was yelling. It wasn't
there
just
was yelling.
There was yelling. There was yelling. You did a lot.
The
connecting of the dots.
Yeah,
it's there.
Yeah,
it's absolutely there. You have also worked as a book editor. You have a terrific editor who I'm very fond of, Andy Ward. Are you, when you're writing though, are you editing as you go, or are you just handing it over to him?
I am editing as I go. For it comes and goes. Like sometimes I'm revising, but other times it's like just keep going.
Right.
You'll revise later. This book was kind of unusual because I got to the end of a very long and actually quite different draft before this historical element really kicked in.
I think you warned me about that
Did
at
I mention
lunch
this?
And
Yeah.
I think we did talk about this, and you were like, "Well,
I've been talking about this book with
for a
Miwa
while,
for years.
I've known this was coming."
Yeah. And anyway, but that was kind of the occasion for like a major reboot. That was actually more my agent PJ very gently saying, but it was good. It was good that he said that. And I think one thing kind of, if that was phase one, like phase two of the writing of the book, I was pretty ruthless with myself.
Yeah,
like, so almost like as my own editor. And obviously Andy did like an amazing job when that kind of second version came in, and kind of, I wrote whole new sections to try to address the thoughts that he had. And he wasn't asking for that. But in my mind, I was like, I'll write this new chapter set in the 70s because that'll kind of, piece things together. As a book editor, when I edited books, there's some books that come in and you just they're ready to go. They're ready to be in hardcovers. And others where you're like, let's mess this up a little bit. Let's find out what's working, what's not. And I think I was able to do that with this in the second phase. Yeah.
I also don't think you turn off that muscle.
Yes.
Right? Like, I don't think writers turn off the editorial muscle. I don't think editors turn off the writing muscle. Like, I've met people who, as they're learning to write, they have that really stiff, like, I must use the words and the punctuation and everything must be oratory, and you're just like, sweetie, you're writing book copy. Right. It's got to swing a little bit. It's got to swing.
Well,
like, we can't. You're not delivering a dissertation. I need you to make someone want to pick up this book.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, part of this book is just a comic novel. It's like Personal Days. And that's maybe my natural mode, right? I like to write jokes and stuff.
Oh my God, we're funny?
And so, yeah, I'm a little bit. Well, sometimes. But one of the things is, for a book that takes this long, like that early chapter that I mentioned, this big dinner scene, like, it was like a joke fest, right? But then, year 7, I'm looking at that same chapter for like, it could have been like the 80th time. And it's like, if the jokes aren't still working, I'm going to cut them. Like, they have to be, they could have worked in 2014, but they got to work in 2023.
Cousin jokes always work, though, if you're Asian. I'm sorry, like, everyone's
What's
a cousin.
Oh,
cousin jokes
There's
always
some cousin
work.
jokes,
like,
yeah.
Those are kind of the classic ones that we need to hold tight. But I also say this as someone, my grandfather was one of 12 children. I have so many cousins. I have so many cousins. Ed, you really did give us so many questions. Sprout coming back, the dog?
Oh my God, you're the only one who's picked up on this. So
No.
There's a dog, somebody from the audience. Yes, Julie, the great Julie Atsuka, my idol. Yes,
that makes two of us.
There was my friend Kevin Wynn joked that this was the long-awaited sequel to Personal Days, but the only connection is that the dog in this book is named Sprout, and that was the name of the boss in Personal Days.
I mean,
maybe he's the reincarnation.
I was kind of hoping and I was kind of assuming, but Sprout shows up in a couple of ways in this book where dogs digging holes isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it was good. It was clever.
Yeah.
It was clever.
He actually wound up playing a pretty big role. The dog, that is. Yeah.
And that's all we're going to say.
That's all we're going to say.
This book actually feels more personal than Personal Days in a lot of ways. It feels totally like there is so much of you in this book.
Yep.
And I'm not talking about, Soon's 3 lines of biography. I'm talking about you as Ed Park critic and writer and dad and just thinker, I mean, for want of a better word, right? Philosopher king. It's like you left it all on the field. Pardon the bad sports metaphor. But
yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Even though Personal Days was called Personal Days, like, I mean, a lot of my thoughts about working in an office were definitely in that book.
Fair.
But not my thoughts about, I wasn't a dad yet, but also nothing about being Korean and growing up in Buffalo. There wasn't any hockey that I know of. Yeah, in a way, I mean, this goes back to your question about like when did I have fun? It's sort of maybe that realization that as someone who doesn't think of himself as an autobiographical writer, in terms of fiction, like there was a way to use life material in a way that felt true to my instincts as a fiction writer too, right? And make it kind of work as a novel. And this character's life starts out like mine and then ends up nowhere near mine. So at the very least, it's nice to have a character born in 1970, so I can, at every age, I'm like, oh yeah, he was watching MASH then or whatever, and listening to Rush.
I mean, the reference. Worst things have happened. It could have been Boston, who I've seen live at the Worcester Centrum, but we won't go there. We did a lot of. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And very American.
Yeah.
Right. Like, what gets more American than like Rush and Boston and like all of those big like crazy? Yeah. Okay. Anyway.
Well, I mentioned the band Asia in the book, and when that band came out, nobody was Asian in that group, right? It was all like people from like ELP and Yes and stuff. But I was like, I gotta buy this tape. This is Asia.
We did a lot with very little back in the day. Like, we really, really did a lot with very, very little.
Well, it's interesting though, because like any glimpse of like possible representation of anything Asian, you kind of gravitate toward. And there was one Korean stand-up named Johnny Yoon back in those days, and he would come on the Tonight Show sometimes and like tell some jokes and sing. And he was actually in a movie called They Call Me Bruce, which was kind of a flop, but it was sort of interesting. Like there was nobody else, like no other Korean actor that I could think of who starred in his own movie.
We settled for a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
we settled. Possibly too often. But I'm going to ask two of Ed's questions because they're making me laugh.
Okay.
Are your awesome words in Criterion's Rosemary Baby the reason it's collector's edition?
So I wrote the liner notes to the movie Rosemary's Baby. I don't think that's the reason why, but interesting. We're on the Upper West Side. Watching that movie a lot and learning about the filming and the mystique of it. The Upper West Side does come up in the book, so I feel like I was kind of like vibrating on that uncanny UWS wavelength.
All right, and then which Korean kingdom was the best?
I don't know. You mean which of the three kingdoms of yore?
I have watched none of them, so
I guess the Shilla dynasty. I don't know.
No, listen, part of the fun of reading Ed, and you guys know this, and I'm preaching to the people who are listening from wherever.
In the future.
You've written about D&D for The New Yorker. You've written about Dune, which is a movie that I still go back and forth. I've seen the new version, and I'm still, I don't know how I feel about it. But when you explain it as like the ultimate adolescent boy fantasy, I'm like, oh yeah, that really makes sense. That makes so much sense. And here you are pulling from all of these different places, right? And then you turn around and you're writing about Kristóf in the New York Review of Books.
Yeah, I like to go high and low. Like I think those are my interests, I guess. But I think there's something like powerful about. So we're talking about this book, The Notebook, by a Hungarian writer named Ágota, Kristóf, told in the voice of identical twins in a time of war in an unnamed country, and it's like the most brutal, hilarious, perfect novel that I've read, maybe like from it's from the 80s, but also Dune or Dungeons and Dragons. Like these things are also very important to me, and I think it's partly like the books you read when you're a certain age, like Vonnegut or Brodigan or whatever, Philip K. Dick. The games you play, in this case D&D, like they stay with you. Like I don't play D&D now, but I think about it a lot.
But it's also story, right? Like all of this is foundational story work. And again, I come back to this idea that, you don't have to stick to a genre, like find the thing where your voice is, right? Like if I think about the writers that I love, there's some weird stuff in there. And then there's the stuff that does not age well, that we shall not speak of ever again.
Interesting. Yeah.
Oh, Henry Miller, you do not age well.
Right.
Wow. But all of these pieces, right? Like as a reader, you bring your own experience to whatever you're reading. And as a writer, obviously, that's the place you start, but you're also a reader.
Yeah.
Right? Like you don't separate the two. There isn't the part of Ed's brain that is the writer part and the reader part. There's Ed, the guy who sits down and creates this world.
And I think I was, this is my second published novel, but I think I was comfortable enough with my own voice. Like I know what my voice is, I know what my sensibility is, that it's like I could invite all these influences into this book. There's a little bit of that in Personal Days, but this is much more, I mentioned Yi Sung, this Korean modernist poet. It's like, he wrote these really this word probably should not be used with Asian people. Inscrutable poems. They're like real, but they're inscrutable even to Koreans, right? But he is like one of the most famous poets, writers of all Korean literature. There's a big prize called the Isang Prize that Hong Kong won for the vegetarian. What if these poems, which are formatted so strangely, sometimes it's a grid of numbers that are like reversed as if in a mirror. What if these were all because he was a spy for the Korean provisional government? Like, what if, like, that's where the fiction kicks in? It's like, what do I do with this thing that I've been thinking about for 25 years? How do I put it in my book?
Okay, and maybe it's not fiction.
And
I don't know.
Maybe
I mean, it could have been.
It could have, yeah. We don't know what he was doing in Japan in 1937.
All right, so what's next? Do we wait another 15 years?
We do not wait another 15 years.
Yes, we win.
I have a book of stories that'll hopefully come out before too long. I mean, they're all written, and actually a lot of them were kind of written around the same time I started. I mean, they were gathered back in 2014. Some were even older, talking about stuff that doesn't age well. Like, I really went through and took out the ones I didn't like, put in some newer ones that I wrote. And then there's, I feel pretty excited. I'm writing another novel, and kind of, you finish a book and it has to be edited and everything. During that time, I was also just kind of thinking about this other book that I guess I'm calling sort of a K-horror novel, but with historical elements, a little bit of the same bed, different dreams flavor.
I'm good with it.
But, okay,
keep bringing it.
I think
it.
It'll be interesting. Yeah, but hopefully not another 9 years.
Okay, but flipping between short stories and something as sort of heftier.
Yeah.
As a novel like Same Bed, Different Dreams, that is a different set of muscles, right? Like writing short stories versus being able to sit with multiple narratives in a novel. Mm-hmm. I'm a little surprised to hear you say that stories are even on the horizon.
Well, I think I'm fond of these stories because there was like a time when I was working as an editor, it's
yes, when the New York Times called you John. That was fun.
What's that?
There's a little news article about Ed, and there's a correction at the bottom that says, "Oh, we misstated his name." He's not John.
Weird.
I was like,
anyway, they've learned their lesson, but I think like while many of these stories kind of came about because somebody would ask me to do a reading, and I didn't want to read from Personal Days again, so I'd write a story for that reading,
okay.
And
that's fair.
I think 3 of them, Michael Miller at Book Forum, like they have this Valentine's Day reading. And so 3 of the stories are like, I wrote them for Michael, And so you kind of gather these things, but you think they're all their own thing and disconnected from each other. But once you gather them, you can kind of see the themes come through. But I'm a very different short story writer. Like I think with stories, I think it's a good strategy just for any kind of story, but you got to hook the reader up front. Usually for me, like make them laugh, like just have the jokes and the wordplay, like, go full tilt from the beginning, because you're going to be out of it in 10 pages, right? And you just want to leave that impression. And also the fact that a lot of these were written to be read. I think knowing that's actually a good editor. Internally, that's a really good editor.
Yeah, early on for the show, before we were doing a video piece of it, I had to edit the audio. I just want to point out I'm a bookseller, and I learned how to edit. That was wild. It changed the way I interview, because I was like, I don't want to sit here and have to clean up my own ramblings.
So it was like, okay. It helped you shape the questions.
Oh, much better. Much better. Because, early on, I was kind of like, well, I don't know what I'm doing, and we don't have the budget for an editor, and hello, world, we're just going to make a show and see what happens. So we'll have a different conversation then when the story collection comes out,
Yeah. Okay, I would love that.
Ed Park, thank you so much.
You.
I'm Miwa Messer. This is Poured Over. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Miwa.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.